I'm Justy. Welcome back to the Skeptheist, an ongoing series of videos in which I discuss aspects of science and philosophy. Today's episode is called Dear Doubting Dawkins. The other day I was driving with my son through the streets of Sydney and I saw a really prominent billboard that said Dear Mr. Dawkins. And I couldn't stop to read it at the time, so when I got home I looked it up on the net, and sure enough there's a site called doubtingdawkins.com. And this site, in particular, the arguments they present, is the focus of today's show. I'm hoping I can keep it to one show because there is quite a bit to cover and I don't want to do it justice. But there are four major points that they make on this site. After a fairly patronising preface, the points are: we agree your God is a delusion. And there are six subpoints under that. Number 2, Jesus is the best evidence for God. And there's 5 subpoints under that one. Number 3, if evil doesn't exist, how can religion be evil? There's 2 subpoints. 4, atheism is not unbiased, and there's 5 subpoints under that. So I'll go through at least some of these now. To preface my response to this, I see this tract as hypocritical, full of straw men. If you don't know what a straw man is, it's an argument that was not made. In other words, a refutation to an argument that was never made. For example, they say God is not an equation, and I don't think Dawkins ever really put it in that phraseology. That kind of response, incidentally, is something that irks me because it paints scientific endeavour in a way that's a caricature and not an actual representation of what it's like. But let's go through these points, shall we? And as I say, there are a number of themes that, not surprisingly, a number of themes that run through this in terms of the kinds of philosophical errors that they make. And when I say philosophical, I mean argumentative. So one of the subpoints that I think is interesting, and these subpoints have subpoints, and in some cases subpoints, which is difficult to respond to. I mean, it's great that they've gone to the trouble, but I think for a 10 or 15-minute show, it's not going to be feasible. But the first problem I have with this entire site and this kind of line of reasoning is it sort of purports to be rational and reasonable, and then just throws up its arms in that respect. So what I mean is that the 1A, if you're following along at home, is we agree your God is a delusion. The God you create and then deny isn't the particular God who's there. So I like the fact that they see some room for a different definition of the word God. I mean, it'd be hard not to. But what I don't like is how they then say, well, it's this kind of, and I was reading about this today, it's this like a Gnostic theism as opposed to an agnostic theism, where the Gnostic theist claims to have special knowledge that other people don't have. So let's go through them one by one, shall we? The first one is, we agree your God is a delusion, and they put quotes around the word delusion. And the first subpoint to that is, the God you create and then deny isn't the particular God who's there. And then if you expand that, there is further stuff here. There's the God hypothesis, truth versus explanatory value, and conclusion, a hole in the argument. And these are wordy and they do go on a bit, but the first one, the God hypothesis, I thought was interesting because it mentions the supernatural, and the previous episode was about superstition, and sort of dancing around the edges there of what is supernatural. I've definitely an episode coming up about what's supernatural. But this stuff relates to the mind-body problem that Descartes laid out many years ago, and that is about kinds of stuff. So Descartes' theology is irrelevant to this discussion in that he was on more about kinds of stuff, so atomic stuff and mind stuff. So the mind-body problem is we can't, put our finger on where the mind is, and we know it's in the brain, but even that, given bodies are integral to how our minds develop, is still a bit, one must make that point cautiously. But essentially, because mind is not stuff, it is reasoned, or was reasoned, and still is, of course, that is made of a different kind of stuff. And the analogous thing with religion here is spirit. We have a spirit that inhabits our body, and this is quite distinct from spirituality, by the way, which is a topic for another talk. But so that's the fundamental problem here. Is Is it all the same kind of stuff, or is it more than one kind of stuff? And I don't mean hydrogen, oxygen, different types of atoms, but essentially material stuff versus immaterial stuff. And as was shown hundreds of years ago, the problem with this is the fact that the arguments presented contradict themselves. So on the one hand, it's a different kind of stuff. It doesn't interact with the other kind of stuff, or the first kind of stuff. And simultaneously, it can interact with that kind of stuff. In other words, my mind makes my body move, and ghosts rattle chains, if you want to go there. And so it's very shaky ground to start off with to say that whatever this God thing is, if it's made of this other stuff that we can't sort of know about, then how can we know about it? So the fundamental hypocrisy that runs through pretty much this entire website is, and this is something I've never been able to understand, and to be clear, I think that if it could be understood, I would be able to understand it, and that is that the hypocrisy, the self-contradicting nature of God is unknowable, God moves in mysterious ways. Later on in this thing, by the way, they say that God is it's 1C, by the way. God is not an equation, he's a person. Don't get me started about the he, she, it thing, so arrogant, presumptuous, and misogynistic to assume that it's a male person. And just insane to think that it's a person. This thing that could create the universe is a person. I mean, come on, anthropomorphization on steroids here. But the real problem, of course, is that, and it's in 1B, by the way, too. Why should God be made of the same stuff as us? Okay, so now you're going down this mind-body or dualism kind of avenue, which, as I said before, is very, very shaky ground to start off with. Shakier still when the conclusion that's made beyond that is this thing is made of, let's just say, this is God, okay, and this is made of a different stuff to us, okay. Now that straight away gets into the realm of stuff that is unfalsifiable, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But then to then presume that we can know anything about this thing that's different from us it's insane. It's absolutely insane. So that's the problem I have with those parts to this rebuttal, or to this Dear Mr. Dawkins website. God is an equation. God is not an equation, he's a person. Science knows well that human volition cannot be modelled predictably. So what they're doing here is they're saying, well, God is a person and people can't be predicted, so how can we know anything about God? So this argument is invalid and insound. It's a non sequitur. And it's so wrong in so many ways. The premises are false, the chain of reasoning is flawed, and the conclusion is false as well. So what more can one say? So they simultaneously attempt to say that God is a person, and so is outside what we can know. Maybe they should read a bit of Skinner. They should read a bit of psychology and human behaviour studies. It's not an unknowable thing. It's not knowable to the degree that some things are. But then again, kids, what is knowable? Maths and philosophy are the only things that are truly, knowable with 100% degree of certainty. You might think that a human being is far harder to predict and model than a couple of atoms, and in some sense that's true. But in another sense, even the simplest systems are unpredictable. Like a three-body gravitational system is a chaotic system and can't be predicted. Things can be known about it, but where those atoms will be at a certain amount of time, due to chaos theory and creeping errors and everything, can't be known. So it's never been said that even simple systems can be understood, and that's what science does, and people is this whole different thing. That is a gross, childish simplification of the actual situation. And there's a lot of stuff here too about how Dawkins conducts himself, and I'm not a Dawkins apologist. I'm a fan, let's be clear, and to that end, I don't know if you are necessarily an iPhone user, but I wrote this and dedicated it to Mr. Dawkins. So clearly I'm a fan. And much like Noam Chomsky's work, I'm more into his work with linguistics than I am for his political stuff. So too, I'm more into Dawkins' work when it comes to explaining evolution than I am with any of this stuff, the vitriolic anti-religious stuff that he goes on about. However, I do think he has a very valid point. And the best way I've seen it expressed, by the way, is that imagine you're at a party and there was someone who was carrying on in this really strange way, like talking to someone who wasn't there, and that would make you uncomfortable. It would make you concerned for that person's mental health. And, the fact is that from our point of view anyway, the people who go on and on about this thing that they can't understand, they tell us that God can't be understood, and yet they're making all these assertions about it, and they feel it in their lives and all the rest of it. And, all of those things have, quite mundane explanations as to why we feel so emotional about certain things. And, it's human psychology, it's brain chemistry, all these things are known. Unfortunately, the subjective experiences people have that they then attribute to this thing that's greater than them, which is God. I think it's a form of mental illness, and it's a complex situation. So I wouldn't ever want to attempt to say, in a blanket way, that if you believe in God, you're a nut job. On the other hand, if we look at the aspects of religion, and I'm going off topic here and not actually answering these points, but I have a sort of a central case to make here about religious thinking. And by the way, one of the rebuttals here, and I promise I'll come back from these tangents, is that Dawkins says that he doesn't despise religious people; he despises their beliefs. After a while, though, if someone has that belief and will not let it go, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, it's hard not to despise that person, but get a bit sick of the carry-on, essentially. It's a cliche about someone coming to the door and saying, "Have you read this book?" But I mean that's the least of worries. But even that's annoying, to have someone who hasn't actually gone through the rebuttals to these arguments that have been made hundreds of years ago, let alone in recent times. On my Facebook page, it says, one of the photos anyway, the Skeptheist Facebook page, it says, quoting myself, I'm probably going to misquote, but please read the many and varied refutations to the arguments for the existence of God before slavishly repeating them. That's something I think should be addressed before any of this other stuff. It's like, well, have you read these counter arguments? The blind watchmaker, or the watchmaker's argument, was refuted hundreds of years ago. It's easy to see why atheists and philosophers and people who really like to think about this sort of stuff get very tired and upset, and even in Dawkins' case, vitriolic about this stuff, when it's like a remedial thing. It's like a kid coming back to you saying, I can't make this thing work. Well, have you tried that? I told you how to do that. What? And you know what I mean? Like, you get pretty frustrated, and it would require calm and patience, and of course, it does. But I'm off topics somewhat. The four refutations to Dawkins, or attacks on Dawkins, you might say, we agree God is a delusion. There's a lot there, but I think I've covered the measure of it. Number two, Jesus is the best evidence for God. Well, as far as I know, there is no extra biblical evidence for this fellow. But as has been said before, the teachings of this character can be examined for their validity. They're not all good, by the way. People like to go on about, oh yeah, the Old Testament's horrible, and yeah, stone your kid and all this sort of stuff, but the New Testament gets it all right. Wrong. It does not get it all right. It says things like, live for today because there will be no tomorrow. So, if you're in Australia, the concept of superannuation cannot apply. Jesus is not the best evidence for God. I mean, it's poor evidence for God. It's like a character, and you know how stories evolve. They if they're interesting stories, they're going to propagate. So the truth of a story and the interest of the story are two things that don't necessarily relate to each other, but both contribute to the success of the spreading of the idea. So if you heard about this superhero who could turn water to wine and multiply fish to feed the masses, and died and came back to life, of course you're probably going to spread that story, and I do think that that's really, I'd like to be quoted as saying, religion, it's all just a terrible misunderstanding. It really has just gotten out of hand, and these things happen, and so number two can be pretty much dismissed. I think it's Christianity isn't blind faith, it's based on evidence, perfectly acceptable evidence called history. Well, no. I mean, if it were, then yes, but it's not. There's really no evidence. Number 3, if evil doesn't exist, how can religion be evil? First you say the universe appears to have no design, no purpose, no evil and no good. They really are straw manning what Richard Dawkins has said here, because he is not saying that there should be no inherent morals in our society and that we can't differentiate between good and evil. He's simply saying that there's no higher agency that dictates what those things are and enforces them. And it is ironic that you have strong moral convictions. No, it's not. Anyway, finally, atheism is not unbiased. There's no such thing as neutral territory. Ironically, atheism is a theological or metaphysical position that is simply incorrect. It is an absence of such a position, not a scientific one. Now, I'd have to say that, personally speaking, I am atheistic as well as, anti-theistic as well as atheistic. But that's my personal position. But atheism is on trial here, not anti-theism. Okay, so to summarise today's episode, and this is not an easy task, by the way, my refutation to the arguments made here, the assertions made on this Doubting Dawkins site, is that they are riddled with hypocrisy. They're riddled with logical inconsistencies and logical fallacies. I don't want to say we shouldn't be surprised that this is the case, but that is the case. The first thing that you read on this site, I think, is quite enlightening, and that is, they say, "We're delighted that you and other members of the New Atheist community," and they do us a favour, they give us a name, New Atheist community, are reading our website. Welcome! It's our prayer to God that you're willing to humbly re-examine some of your fundamental presuppositions that are currently shaping your naturalistic worldview. Now, this is just rude. It's almost like saying, we were right all along, and we asked God for you to come here, and look, you're here. You know, I mean, come on. That you're willing to humbly re-examine some of your fundamental presuppositions that are currently shaping your naturalistic worldview. That's particularly patronising, because as any skeptic would know, that is what we do 25 times a second every day, presuming you think at 25 frames a second. I mean, this is part of the gig. You know, if you're a skeptic, you are always re-examining your worldview. It's harder to re-examine your philosophical worldview, because that's what you use to examine everything else, and these are just facts of reality. You know, it's possible to write a function that calls itself an infinite number of times. It doesn't mean that the universe explodes. It's just something that can be done. And similarly, I have to take a philosophical position, put a line in the sand or a stake in the ground, which in my case is I doubt, therefore I am, the Descartesian one. That's all I can really know, is that I doubt, and therefore I am. Because we would be insane otherwise. If there was nothing to anchor to, nothing could be done, right? And that doesn't mean, and this is an assertion that's made quite a few times in this tract, it doesn't mean that we can just pick some arbitrary assertion like this thing exists, you can't see it, I know it, I feel it, it loves me, where is it? And it exists, and that's all there is to it. You know, that is insane, and it's childish, and it's what gets the backup of anyone who considers themselves a free thinker and a rationalist, with any degree of consistency. I'm not denying that it's very hard not to be hypocritical 100% of the time. I guess what I'm saying here is that these arguments have been made many, many times before, and they have been refuted many, many times before. I'll give you an example of this kind of thing. It's been said to me personally a number of times by people of a theistic bent, and I'll paraphrase of course, but I can't believe that all this came about by random chance, or I can't believe all this came about by accident. And I guess there's two things there. One is, well, why not? If that was the case, could you not believe it? I mean, this is nitpicking, and this is not as big a point as I want to make for the second part of this, but I can't believe that. It's like an incredulity that I think is really close-minded. I mean, if it all came about by random chance, why couldn't you believe it? But the main thing here, of course, is that this is a massive straw man. I won't say no one has ever said that it came about by random chance, because I can't make that assertion, but the primary scientific consensus about evolution, about the evolution of us, the evolution of life in general, the evolution of the solar system, is that it wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. I mean, accident's a horrible word to use in this sense, but it wasn't a random chance. Anyone who takes that position should really read Richard Dawkins, while we're being fanboys for Richard Dawkins, Climbing Mount Improbable, in which it's explained very clearly how these things can happen, that it's almost inevitable that they will happen. In other words, it's not extremely unlikely, it's almost inevitable that it will happen. It's not like a 1 in a trillion chance that this thing happened to come together. It's lots of little incremental changes. I mean, it's such a simple thing to understand. I do despair, actually. So I don't get angry, but I kind of despair. I despair at the prospect of what, say, the remaining 40 years of my life are going to be spent experiencing in a world where, let's face it, kids, we really should be, communicators. Star Trek, Star Wars, take your pick. Star Trek probably better than Star Wars, let's face it, in terms of how the universe operates. But my point is, we should be further along the track, I think, than we are. And I point the finger squarely at religious thinking, not the propensity of religions to organise people into groups, not the propensity of religion to help other groups of people. And I really mean help. I don't mean deny them condoms, right? I mean take them in off the street, care for them, feed them. I know personally people who do this, okay, and obviously that's not what I'm attacking here. What I'm attacking is dogmatic thinking and, an unwillingness to question assumptions. And I'm also attacking this sort of remedial thing of these arguments have been made so many times before, and they seem to just keep being trotted out and out and out, and it would be nice if that came to a stop. Unfortunately, for most people, that also involves them accepting that there is no Sky Daddy and that there's no afterlife, or at least the best that we can say is that it's highly unlikely that there is, or that we cannot make that assumption or assertion with an acceptably high degree of certainty. Let's put it that way. Obviously, we can't say anything with a high degree or with an absolute degree of certainty other than theorems in mathematics and philosophy and geometry and so forth. In other words, things that we've made up ourselves. But things about the world that we experience, we can make assertions about them that have a degree of certainty. Like, just as sure as the sun comes up tomorrow, that's one that we can probably count on. It doesn't mean it will happen, though. It may not come up tomorrow, but it's highly likely. There is a God. Well, that's not one of those statements, I think, as far as any rational thought process is concerned. So I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
I'm a skeptheist, skeptical atheist. Skeptics have open mind, didn't you know? If you didn't know, maybe watch the show. It's called The Skeptheist. When you have an open mind, you can grow. If you say you're open-minded, try to put some work behind a skeptheist.